Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 character building guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today, we're covering a strictly lore-accurate build for Wyll. I'm going to be following as closely as possible to his character and established lore, taking only class levels and subclasses that he is known to have, according to the game, to make the most lore-accurate Wyll build possible, while also still making a very powerful and honor mode viable character. Wyll is a pretty tricky character to play, I think, if you are trying to build him according to his established lore, because he's a melee warlock, and that's a difficult character class to make work, because warlocks, by nature, want to be sort of at range and casting spells. They get great melee options, but don't have the defensive capabilities that other melee classes have to support them. So you need to build a little bit carefully in order to make use of Wyll's melee capabilities to the maximum extent. By doing so, though, we get access to an extremely powerful class feature that that no other build, in fact, can make use of, which will let us do tremendous melee damage, especially in the late game, and we get some of the most broken mechanics in the game. So we're still going to end up with an extremely powerful character, while following closely to the established lore of the character. Alright, let's get to the build. We're obviously using Wyll as the example character here, but this can, of course, be used for a main character and will work just as well. If you want to build a custom character with this, then human is actually still a pretty good pick, because one thing that warlocks can really benefit from is gaining shield proficiency, but the best possible pick for a warlock is going to be half drow, because they get shield proficiency and extra casts of darkness every day, Dwergar for the invisibility, or wood elf for the bonus moves, half wood elf especially for the bonus move speed, are also still very good, but half drow gets the nod because additional casts of darkness enable you to abuse one of the most broken mechanics in the game, the Cloud of Darkness, as often as possible. For Wyll, though, of course, we get our human proficiencies, which gives us shield proficiency on top of Warlock's normal light armor proficiency, which is very helpful, giving us access to a ton of very powerful items for us and increasing our defenses, which is something that we would otherwise struggle a little bit with when building this character, since Warlocks are by nature a little bit squishy. For our ability point selection, we are going to... You can leave this on Wyll's starting ability scores. If you really don't want to respec at all, you can do that, and it will definitely make your character weaker, but it's not going to totally cripple it. The main downside is that you have a lot of extra points in intelligence, which you don't need at all. So when we're building our character, we're going to get rid of those, drop our charisma to 16, and we will take 16 constitution, 14 dexterity, 12 wisdom, and 16 charisma. This will give us a little bit more hit points, so we can stand toe-to-toe with enemies in the front line, and the charisma that we need in order to fight, of course, as well as a better wisdom save, and the ability to concentrate reasonably well on spells, even if we take a hit. This character will, of course, be concentrating on spells frequently, so we want high constitution to enable us to have a good concentration saving throw, so when we get hit, we don't drop concentration on our spells. For our skill proficiency here, Wyll's starting skills are actually totally reasonable. You have persuasion proficiency already and intimidation proficiency, so those are both totally fine. Arcana is not terribly useful for him, and so I would suggest putting this into deception. We're going to have very high charisma and very low intelligence, so we're going to want to just have all of the dialogue skills, and then you can use this character as a party face, because we have all of the charisma skills, so they can do all of the talking. For our subclass selection, we're going to be taking the Fiend, for story reasons of course, but also because it's actually just very good for a melee warlock. As a squishy melee character, one of the things that we need is survivability. The Fiend gives us that through its subclass feature, Dark One's Blessing. Whenever we kill an enemy, as the Fiend Warlock, we gain temporary hit points. It doesn't actually tell you how this is calculated, but it's temporary hit points equal to your charisma modifier, which starts at +3 and can increase up to +7 by the end of the game with certain story events, plus our Warlock level. So by the end of the game, we'll be gaining 19 temporary hit points every time we kill an enemy. This build is going to do tremendous amounts of damage, so you'll be killing enemies quite frequently, and can constantly be refreshing the supply of temporary hit points, so you get effectively quite a lot of healing out out of being the Fiend Warlock, which can make up for the fact that your character is otherwise pretty squishy. Fiend also gives us access to a very important spell, which we're going to select right at level 1, and that spell is Command. Fiend Warlock is the only Warlock that gets access to Command, and Command is one of the best spells in the entire game, and even better for Warlocks. You can command an enemy to drop to the ground, and that costs them their entire turn, gives you advantage on attacks against them, and as a Warlock, the number of creatures that you can target scales up as you level up. Because Warlock spells increase in their level as you level up the Warlock, when you are a low-level Warlock, you're only commanding 1 creature, but at higher levels, you'll be commanding 5 creatures to drop to the ground without spending a higher-level spell slot. So, Warlock can disable an entire encounter by using Command, so it's just a very, very powerful spell to have access to. So we're going to pick that up at level 1, and we're also going to take Hex. This is what's going to enable us to do a bunch of damage. Bonus action Hex plus cast Eldritch Blast will be our normal damage output for the first couple levels, and even later on we're going to use Hex in combination with our melee attacks to increase our damage output significantly. Finally, for our cantrip selection, we're going to take Eldritch Blast. This is the best damage cantrip in the game and an incredible ranged weapon. So this gives us both a powerful ranged option as well as a powerful melee option. And for our second cantrip here, there's a couple different options that you can take. You can use Friends, which is still pretty useful for charisma characters even on honor mode, where it counts as committing a crime, because you can use it to pass dialogue checks and then run away or disguise yourself in some way to avoid suffering the consequences of the crime and get free advantage on all your charisma checks. Or you can take Minor Illusion, which is really important for every party to have, because you can use it before combat starts to group enemies up, since they'll walk over to investigate it, and then drop one of your powerful AoE effects on the heads of the enemies. For this character, I'm going to recommend Minor Illusion if you don't have it elsewhere in your party, because it's so good with this character's AoE abilities, of which we're going to get a ton. So now, we've taken Eldritch Blast and Minor Illusion for our cantrips, Fiend for our subclass, Command and Hex for our spells, and done our ability scores, so that's everything that we need to do at level 1. Let's move on to level 2. At Warlock level 2, we get access to another level 1 spell, as well as 2 Eldritch Invocations. So, for our spell, we're going to take Armor of Agathis. This gives us additional temporary hit points, which, combined with our Fiend temporary hit points, can give us a lot of longevity, and it's a day-long buff, so if you're not taking hits, then the Armor of Agathis can carry over throughout the entire day, and it does retaliation damage to any enemy that hits you. This is another one that scales automatically with our Warlock spells as we level up. So currently it only does 5 temporary hit points and 5 cold damage, but when we hit level 3 and all our Warlock spells become level 2, it'll give us 10 hit points and deal 10 damage. And then at level 5, it'll deal 15 and it'll give us 15 and deal 15. So we're going to be automatically scaling this as we level up, which can help increase our survivability significantly. The way this interacts with the Fiend temporary hit points is also a little bit weird, but basically the Fiend temporary hit points can, as long as you don't lose your last temporary hit point from Armor of Agathis, the Fiend temporary hit points will keep the Armor of Agathis retaliation damage. So if you never take more damage than the total from your Armor of Agathis, you'll constantly be refreshing the retaliation damage on it, which does an incredible amount of return damage if enemies actually manage to hit you. Since we're in melee with this character, enemies will hit you a little more often than will happen with other Warlock variants, so we're going to be getting a lot of retaliation damage from Armor of Agathis. For our Eldritch Invocations here, we're going to take Agonizing Blast. I think that 100% of Warlocks should take Agonizing Blast. Even though we intend to be in melee, it increases the damage of our Eldritch Blast when we fire it at range, which just gives us an incredible ranged option, and is just too powerful to pass up on. It gives us something to do when we don't want to be in melee or can't reach melee enemies, as well, of course, as at level 2 specifically, we don't yet have our ability that lets us function in melee, so Eldritch Blast is still our main combat option at this level as well. We're also going to take Devil's Sight, which isn't useful this level, but next level is going to let us use the Darkness spell to its maximum effect, and so is very important to have access to as early as possible. We don't need to replace a spell, because our spell selection is already perfect. We were geniuses and did it right the first time, so let's move on to level 3. At Warlock level 3, we get to select our Pact boon. And for Wyll, I think there is only one choice, because we're being a melee Warlock, we're going to take Pact of the Blade. This, as the Blade of Frontiers, obviously, we need to have the Pact of the Blade Warlock, but this also allows us to fight in melee using any melee weapon and using our Charisma for the attack and damage. That means that our spellcasting is done with our Charisma, our ranged attacks are done with Charisma, and our melee attacks are done with Charisma, so it makes us much more single attribute dependent than most other characters who don't get to do all of those things using the same attribute. Charisma is also the attribute that can be the highest of any in the game, other than strength from the Cloud Giant elixirs, because you can get, through story events, you can get your Charisma up to 24 for a +7 bonus, so we can be doing +7 to hit and +7 to all of our damage with our Pact of the Blade weapons, with our Eldritch Blasts, and so on, for a tremendous amount of damage output. Then, through additional abilities and itemization, we're going to be able to apply that multiple times per attack. So we're going to be doing 3 times our Charisma to damage by the end game, which is very, very powerful. For our spell selection at this level, we get level 2 spells, and we're going to take Darkness. This is used to cast mostly on yourself, because enemies who can't see through magical darkness or aren't immune to blind cannot shoot into the darkness. So you'll be able to shoot out of it, and they can't shoot into it. It makes your whole party functionally immune to ranged attacks when you're in it. Also, you can walk up to an enemy, cast it on both of you, and then they are blinded, and you have advantage on all of your attacks. They have disadvantage on all of their attacks, so it makes you a much more devastating melee combatant if you can walk up to an enemy and trap them in the darkness effect. Even if they try to leave, you at least get to hit them with an opportunity attack, so you're getting some value out of that. There are other ways to apply darkness, using arrows or other magic items, but knowing the spell is still very important, because this is such a powerful mechanic. Complete immunity to ranged attacks is unbelievably strong, and advantage on all of your attacks and disadvantage on all of your enemies' attacks means that you basically win every fight that you fight inside Clouds of Darkness, so we want to be able to do that as often as possible. We're not going to replace a spell at this level, so let's move on to level 4. And at Warlock level 4, we get our very first feat. Now for Honor Mode, the feat that I'm going to recommend that you take at level 4 most of the time is going to be Alert. +5 to Initiative means we're going to go first in every combat, which means we can lay down darkness before enemies get a chance to shoot us, or we can kill enemies before they get a chance to go. Going first is game winning, so Alert is just so powerful. If you have a lot of initiative gear on this character, or your other characters have Alert, and you don't need it on this character, you could take an ability improvement to boost your Charisma, or if you're playing on a lower difficulty setting and you want to focus on your dialogue skills, another option is to start with 17 Charisma and 10 Wisdom, and take Actor to gain expertise in deception and performance. But for most players, you're going to want to take Alert to just go first in every combat, because combats that you go first in are combats you win a lot more of the time. For our cantrip selection at this level, we're going to pick up Blade Ward, because we now have level 2 Armor of Agathis, and sometimes we're going to be surrounded by big groups of enemies. Blade Ward can give us resistance to the damage when those enemies hit us, and then we deal damage back to them with Armor of Agathis. So if we have a lot of enemies surrounding us, you don't think you're going to be able to kill them and prevent the incoming damage, Blade Ward is really good. Normally, this isn't a great default use of an action. It's not something that you should spend your turn on, all other things being equal. But when you're surrounded by a bunch of enemies, or you're trying to protect your temporary hit points, which this character is very good at generating, Blade Ward is excellent. So it gives you a very powerful tactical option at your disposal. For our spell selection at this level, we are going to go ahead and pick up Misty Step. Every character should have access to Misty Step somewhere in their build, so we're going to pick it up here, just because it's so useful as an emergency panic button, and gives you a lot of additional mobility for when you need it. We don't need to replace a spell again, because most of the time we're still going to be concentrating on either Hex or Darkness, depending on whether we want to kill an enemy really fast or we want defensive options, so we don't need to pick up another concentration spell at this point. If you find you aren't using one of those two spells, you probably should be using one of those two spells more often, but if you really aren't using them, then you could pick up Cloud of Daggers or Hold Person as possible concentration options to replace them. That's it for level 4. Let's go to level 5. And at Warlock level 5, we get 3rd level spells as well as Deepened Pact. So now when we have bound our Pact weapon, we get a second attack with it. Again, that attack is made with our Charisma, so it applies our Charisma to hit and our Charisma to damage, which is great. Means we're a very competent melee fighter. We get extra attack just as fast as martial characters. A fighter or a barbarian or a paladin get extra attack also at level 5, but we're getting full spell casting alongside that. So that's one of the great things about Blade Pact Warlock, is you get the same offensive capabilities as the martial classes, but also all the spellcasting of the spellcasting classes. What you pay for it with is being squishier than the martial classes, but we can make up for that with all the temporary hit points we're generating through Armor of Agathis and Fiend Warlock. For our spell selection at this level, we're going to take Hunger of Hadar, which is just an absolutely fight-winning spell. Hunger of Hadar will just win any encounter that you can keep enemies in it for. It will blind them, deal constant damage, they will be stuck because it's difficult terrain. So this is an amazing option to concentrate on, especially if there are enemies that you can't easily reach, or enemies that you can keep locked down a little bit more easily. We again don't need to replace a spell at this level, although if you are using the Boots or Amulet of Misty Step on this character, you could replace Misty Step with another spell, in which case that spell would be Counterspell. Otherwise, we're going to wait until next level to pick up Counterspell, because Hunger of Hadar is just that important, I think. But both of those are going to be critical options. For our Eldritch Invocation here, we're going to take Repelling Blast, which gives us the option to push an enemy 15 feet when we hit them with Eldritch Blast. The great thing about this is there's no saving throw for it. If you just hit them with Eldritch Blast, they get pushed, so you can knock them off of cliffs, push them into hazardous locations, such as your own Hunger of Hadar or Darkness Clouds, and just keep enemies completely locked down, bounce them away from you when you want them away from you, and then the ones that get towards you, you can hit because you are a powerful melee combatant. So it gives you a lot of agency and control over the battlefield. At level 6, we're going to pick up our other spell, our other level 3 spell, and we're going to pick up Counterspell. Warlocks are both very good and very bad at casting Counterspell. You don't get a lot of spell slots per encounter, so it can be a little bit painful to use Counterspell on one of them, but your spell slots automatically scale, so your Counterspell will almost always be guaranteed to work on enemy spells. Because of how Counterspell works, you want your spell to be on level or higher level than the spell the enemy is casting. Since our spell levels scale automatically, we're not spending more resources to cast higher level counterspells. Spending our reaction to counter an enemy's entire turn is obviously incredibly powerful, so Counterspell is an excellent spell to have at this point. If you have already taken Counterspell, you can go back to the lower levels for a utility option, like Invisibility, or you can just take Fireball to blow up big groups of enemies, Hypnotic Pattern for an alternative to Hunger of Hadar if you don't want if you want to lock down enemies rather than blind and damage them. There are some fights where Hypnotic Pattern is better, and it's better with some late game items, though we'll have more opportunities to pick it up before we acquire those. At level 7, we get 4th level spells, as well as another Eldritch Invocation. The 4th level spell that we're going to take here is going to be Wall of Fire, because it just wins a ton of fights entirely on its own. We do have, at this point, a decent number of concentration spells. We've got Hex, we've got Darkness, we've got Hunger of Hadar, and we've got Wall of Fire. So at this point, it's probably worth it to swap out one of these spells that you are not using, one of these concentration options that you're not using, for a non-concentration spell. The most likely one that you're going to want to swap out at this point is Hex, though there's still some good reasons to keep it, which I will talk about later on when we talk about items. But if you're swapping out Hex, then you're probably going to be swapping in something like Fireball just to clear out large groups of enemies. One thing that this build can struggle with is clearing large groups of enemies, but that's what Wall of Fire does very well, so it's not something that I'm terribly concerned about, and for most players, I'm going to recommend keeping Hex so that we can continue to apply our item effects and the great damage from Hexed Eldritch Blasts and stuff when we just want to kill an enemy as quickly as possible. Though, again, your concentration is a little bit in demand for this build, so if you're finding that you aren't ever using it, just pick up Fireball or something instead. For our Eldritch Invocation pick at this level, I think there are two main options. You can either take Mire the Mind, which gives you Slow. This is yet another concentration spell, but the nice thing about Slow is that it's cast on specific enemies, rather than being something that you cast in an AoE. So it won't accidentally hit you, you won't have to fight inside of your own Hunger of Hadar if you use Slow instead, and it won't hit your allies. So if you have a lot of melee allies who are really suffering because you're using Walls of Fire, Darkness, Hunger of Hadar, stuff that they don't want to fight in, Slow can be a good option for when the battlefield gets really tangled up and you just want to debuff enemies. It's also very good for certain boss fights, so this is what I will recommend. It's really not that big of problem to have a lot of different concentration spells, because your typical play pattern is going to be to pick the perfect one for that encounter, cast it, and then go to town with Eldritch Blasts and melee attacks, so you won't conflict that much with multiple concentration spells, but it is something to be aware of. So we're going to select Mire the Mind, but another possible option is to take Armor of Shadows, so you can cast Mage Armor. If you're using a robe or a set of clothing, this can give you much higher AC, throughout the entire adventuring day. It's free to cast, so you can just use it and just have higher armor class. Render yourself a little less squishy, even if you're using a robe. For the most part though, I think Mire the Mind is going to be better and just give you a lot of additional optionality in, especially in boss encounters or encounters with lots of melee enemies. At Warlock level 8, we get our first feat, and the feat that we're going to take is an ability improvement to increase our charisma. Obviously, we've delayed that a little bit by taking Alert, so we would have liked to be at 20 by now. There are story events that can get you to 20 by this point, and if you are using Ethel's Hair, then you'll have 20 charisma already, but we're always going to be boosting our charisma at level 8. For our spell selection at this level, we're either going to go back and grab a utility spell that we might want from earlier levels, or we're just going to pick up something like Invisibility, if you think that is going to be very useful for your party. Or you can pick up Fireball to clear AoE damage, or if you're using the Band of the Mystic Scoundrel item, you can pick up Hold Person. I think that a lot of players are going to end up doing that, so we're going to pick up Hold Person, because this can be used to give you guaranteed critical hits against enemies. Since we're attacking in melee, we'll always be within 10 feet of them for those critical hits, and against humanoid enemies, Hold Person is devastating. It's also automatically upcast by us being a warlock, so we can hold multiple people at once with a single cast of the spell. At Warlock level 9, we get access to 5th level spells, and the 5th level Warlock spells aren't in and of themselves incredible, but Hold Monster is still very good for all the same reasons that Hold Person is. You can't use it on as many creatures at once, because it's a much higher level spell, so it's only going to cast on one creature, whereas Hold Person is now going to be casting on 4 different people at once. But Hold Monster is going to allow you to paralyze almost any enemy in the game, get automatic critical hits against them, and with the Band of the Mystic Scoundrel item can be cast as a bonus action, so you can use it alongside a whole bunch of attacks. For our Eldritch Invocation here, we're going to take Minions of Chaos, because this is a day-long buff. So you get to summon a very powerful summon using a Warlock spell slot. Warlock spells come back on a short rest, so we're essentially turning a short rest resource into a long rest buff, a day-long buff, and gaining a huge benefit for our later short rests in the adventuring day. This is part of what makes Warlocks have such good longevity throughout the adventuring day, and it can just add a ton of extra power to your party to have the elemental following you around. At level 10, we get another cantrip, and the cantrip that we're going to take is True Strike, because obviously you wouldn't be the Blade of the Frontiers if your blade didn't strike true, and because it really annoys people in the YouTube comments whenever I take True Strike. For our spells here, at this point you should have a pretty good idea of what your party is missing in terms of utility spells. Warlocks, because they have short rest cooldowns, also can get a little more use out of spells that are pretty expensive for other characters to have. Things like Dimension Door or Fly or Gaseous Form can be pretty useful for your characters, even on into the late game. Because Warlocks aren't expending a valuable spell slot to cast them, they can be pretty useful. I actually quite like having Dimension Door available on a Warlock, because Warlocks only get 2 or 3 spells per combat, right? So the 10th spell that we know is so rarely getting cast. What you want is a spell that is, rather than a spell that's going to be a 7 out of 10 in every combat, you want a spell that's going to be a 10 out of 10 in some combats and a 0 out of 10 most of the time. And Dimension Door is exactly that. When you want it, you really, really want it. So even though it's not going to come up that often, it's pretty nice to have on Warlocks who can afford to take that kind of situational spell, because the bottom spells on their list are so infrequently cast. We also, at this level, because we're a Fiend Warlock, get Fiendish Resilience, which is a very powerful ability that lets us choose a damage type once per short rest and just become resistant to it, take half damage from that damage type. I talked already about how it's pretty good to be resistant when you're building a lot of temporary hit points and healing frequently, which this character effectively is with all those temporary hit points. Fiendish Resilience is even better. And you don't have to actually cast Blade Ward in order to get that damage resistance. There's a couple different options for what resistance to set to. The best one, of course, is to set it to the damage type that's most common in whatever encounter you're about to fight. So that's sort of the optimal way to use this ability. By default, a good option is to set it to piercing damage. It's the second most common damage type in the game after slashing, I'm pretty sure. And archers use it, so you're most likely to get hit by it. So if you're just looking for one to sort of set it and forget it, piercing damage is a pretty good option. Though any damage resistance can be pretty useful to have. No matter what you set it to, it will come up at some point. Warlock level 11, we get a third Warlock spell per short rest, which gives us a ton of additional longevity for the adventuring day, and a ton of additional power. Now, with our first long rest, we can cast a Conjure Elemental, we can cast a 5th level Armor of Agathis, and those can last us all day with careful management of the elemental's hit points and our own temporary hit points, giving you a tremendous amount of additional power and letting you still cast 3 spells in other encounters or just take more encounters in a day. Warlocks are one of the best classes at long adventuring days, and this is why, so Wyll can just keep going and going and going. For our Mystic Arcanum, we get a once per long rest 6th level spell slot. And there's really 2 options here that are at all reasonable. You can either take Create Undead, which is a pretty decent summon, and summons are very powerful. It is nice because it's a long rest buff a long rest spell that actually lasts all day, which is pretty nice for a Warlock who otherwise are going to... Something you can only use once per long rest isn't great when you're trying to take really long adventuring days. The other option is to take Eyebite, because it will just win you whatever fight you use it in. Eyebite is a very powerful debuff that you can use pretty frequently to inflict fear on enemies and just lock them down. Very good against bosses to make them repeatedly roll saving throws, otherwise they won't be able to do anything. Overall, I think you're going to be slightly better off with Create Undead, but those 2 are the best options. For our spell selection here, again, at this point you should probably have a good idea of what spells are going to be good options for your party. You could pick up Banishment because it targets charisma saves, and so is very good against enemies with low charisma saves, of which there's a few very important enemies in the game. Or you could pick up Hypnotic Pattern to bonus action cast with the Band of the Mystic Scoundrel. Finally, at Warlock level 12, we get another Eldritch Invocation, which gives us access to a class ability that only this specific character build can use, Life Drinker. Life Drinker gives us the passive where our melee attacks deal additional damage equal to our charisma modifier. So we're dealing double the damage that any other character would be doing with our attacks, or double the bonus damage that any other character would be doing with our attacks, because we're applying our charisma damage twice. With items, we can apply that 3 times over, so that can be plus 21 damage to every single attack we do if we've appropriately maxed out our charisma. That is an absurd amount of damage for this character to be doing with its melee attacks, and is the reason, in my opinion, to go 12 levels of Warlock, 12 levels of melee Warlock, because Life Drinker is such a powerful ability that is otherwise impossible to use, because ranged Warlocks can't make use of this ability. For our spell selection here, we're just going to go back and grab another utility spell or pick up Banishment. And then, of course, for our feat, we're going to max out Charisma so that our weapon hits as frequently and as hard as possible. Alright, my friends, this has been a Fiend Warlock Blade Pact lore-friendly Wyll build, which I have hoped you have enjoyed. But, of course, we can make it even more powerful with appropriate itemization. So let's talk about that. For items for this character, there's a few specific things that we're looking for. Obviously, we need a great weapon in order to bind it as our Pact weapon and make use of it. Now, the best-in-slot weapon requires a very specific story choice to be made, one which you may or may not think is appropriate to Wyll's lore, and one which you may or may not want to make in your specific run. And that weapon is Shar's Spear of Evening. This gives you advantage on saving throws while you're in darkness, and deals additional damage to enemies that are in darkness, makes you immune to blind, which you are already from Devil's Sight, but also lets you cast darkness, both with the weapon itself, and gives you extra casts of darkness, and allows you to cast darkness when attacking. That's a pretty powerful combination, because it combines all of the things that you want to do into a single weapon, while also doing a ton of additional damage. If you don't have Shar's Spear of Evening, the next best is Nirolna, because it's just one of the best one-handed weapons in the entire game, and it has some great synergy with something that we particularly want to do. For our next item, we are going to be looking for the Diadem of Arcane Synergy. Arcane Synergy is an effect that allows you to deal deal additional damage equal to your spellcasting modifier whenever you attack with a weapon. So if we can give ourselves Arcane Synergy, we're going to be dealing not just double, but triple our charisma bonus in damage whenever we hit an enemy. Inflicting a condition is something that we can do pretty easily. There's a lot of different ways that we have to inflict a condition, because just about everything in the game counts as a condition. When we cast darkness on an enemy, they receive blinded. That counts as inflicting a condition and gives us the diadem bonus. But if we want if we cast hex on an enemy, that's a condition, and so on. But if we want a passive way to generate this constantly, one of the best ways is the Gloves of Belligerent Sky, which, whenever we deal thunder damage to an enemy, will give us 2 turns of reverberation on that enemy, which also, incidentally, is a very good ability that can knock enemies prone. Reverberation will give them huge penalties for their saving throws and eventually knock them over to deal additional damage. So Nirolna, with its inherent thunder damage, can be used with the Gloves of Belligerent Skies to inflict conditions and in turn trigger Diadem of Arcane Synergy. If we aren't using Nirolna, we can also use the Drakethroat Glaive. Just hold this in our inventory and use its Draconic Elemental Weapon ability to imbue whatever weapon we're actually attacking with thunder damage. So you can cast this on your weapon, give that weapon thunder damage, That thunder damage then triggers the Gloves of Belligerent Skies. Those gloves then trigger the Diadem of Arcane Synergy, which makes all of your attacks do an incredible amount of extra damage. So it all chains together and gives you a ton of additional power. If you, as an alternative to that, you could also use the Helm of Arcane Acuity. So whenever you deal damage with a weapon, you gain Arcane Acuity. This is if you want to focus more on spellcasting and a little bit less on damage, because this is going to give you additional, as you stack Arcane Acuity, this will give you additional spell save DC, meaning that you can lock down enemies. In combination with the Band of the Mystic Scoundrel, which lets you cast spells as a bonus action after hitting an enemy with a weapon attack, we can attack an enemy and then bonus action command, causing the entire encounter to fall over. So we walk in, we hit someone, and then we bonus action tell everyone to get on the ground, doing our best SWAT team impression, with the Band of the Mystic Scoundrel, and that can take out an entire encounter all at once. We're also, because we're a human, going to want a good shield, and there's really two potential things that you're looking for here, either initiative bonuses with the Sentinel Shield, or spell save DC bonuses with Ketheric's Shield. Spell save DC is very important for this character, so you do want items that increase it. The Strange Conduit Ring is very good for this character as well, because you're almost always going to be concentrating on a spell, and this just makes you deal consistently more damage with every single attack, so that's just a very good additional amount of damage. And then for your armor, you have a couple different options. You can use the Potent Robe, which makes your Eldritch Blasts better if you aren't playing a Dark Urge, and so if you have access to the Potent Robe from the story events that allow you to get it, then this makes your Eldritch Blast better. It gives you extra temporary hit points, which is still very good, very powerful robe. You can also just use any good light armor. The Elegant Studded Light Armor is very good. It gives you +2 initiative and the shield spell, so this gives you still decent armor class with your shield and your light armor, and gives you the shield spell, so if you're going to get attacked, you can react by making that attack miss, plus initiative means you'll always go first. Or, and this I think is pretty on theme as well, you can use the Helldusk armor, which is heavy armor, but any character can wear it. You always count as proficient when you're in the Helldusk armor. So in the late game characters that don't normally have heavy armor proficiency, especially a character like this that wants to get into melee, can benefit very strongly from the extremely high defensive bonus that the Helldusk armor gives you. Finally, this character is one of the best in the game at using haste effects and speed potions on honor mode, because you can use the hasted action to cast a spell after you use your normal action to do some attacks. So you're going to want haste from an ally or potions of speed in your inventory in order to maximize that effect. Alright, my friends, I hope that you've enjoyed this look at the lore-friendly version of Wyll and the very high power, very high damage, and great control offered by a pure melee warlock. And if you have, of course, feel free to leave a comment and like the video. Helps me out with the algorithm, so I do appreciate you taking the time to do that. And you could subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 builds and other strategy game analysis. Cheers, folks. I'll catch you next time.